This is our fifth week together and our second week to look at the local church. We're going to spend most of today thinking about how the local church is organized for its mission and its ministry, how it lives into its vision, how the story of God's people engaged in the Missio Dei has lived itself out in a particular place around a set of core values and practices. You'll recognize all of that words as being church leadership, but they're quite essential. Mission, vision, compelling narrative, core values, and practices, and the plans or strategic planning that we have for the future. I remind us that if we think about the Charge Conference, where we left off last time and our first slide for today, the Charge Conference is basically the governing body of the church, and it must focus all of its responsibilities that are outlined there in the discipline in line with its mission, its vision for the future. It must tend to the strategic plan and the numbers of persons to be hired and deployed as lay leaders in the church around the core values and practices in ministry and mission that we have. It is the Charge Conference that basically is not just a rubber stamp, but actually gives impetus to this future and is connected to the larger church. You will find toward the end of the description in the discipline of the local church that further connectional issues are there. The special Sundays are outlined because they are connections between the denomination itself and the local church. They're connectional Sundays, and you will see those outlined in the discipline. They can drive those who deal with the lectionary absolutely crazy because they may or may not have anything to do with the readings of the day, but they are times of special emphases. Native American Awareness Sunday, for instance, was the expansion of the church into a very important area of repentance, renewal, understanding, and relationship. The one great hour of sharing, this whole understanding of our participation in the United Methodist Committee on Relief, Worldwide Communion Sunday, and our Crusade Scholars, a whole lot of emphases on a variety of our connectional mission and ministry, all of which should be the concern of the Charge Conference because it's part of the connection and the interpretation not only of the local church's mission, vision, and compelling narrative, practices and core values and planning, but also the connectional issues. How are we United Methodists together? And you see that I've tried to blend, and it is important to blend our commitments about the description and function of the church that we talked about last week. But the Charge Conference only happens once a year, or a special called session for specific purposes. So what happens during the rest of the year? The major governance of the local church is then turned over to the church council. And you will recognize here in paragraph 252 and following that the church council carries on this fundamental mission, vision, compelling narrative, core values and practices and planning. As a matter of fact, it says here that they are to take those matters up, the actual program and ministry of the church, before every other thing. It is to continue to vision into the future, to be hopeful, to be future-oriented, and to be able to guide these larger governance issues, to set policies and directions for the whole church. It is important to recognize that in years past, this central governing function was oftentimes a place simply of reporting and rubber stamping what its committees did. And the discipline has recognized that a governing board, a governing council, needs to be the driving force, the primogenitor, if you will, of the view and the future of the church, and that the other committees basically support the ongoing work that is being envisioned by the church council. It's flipping it on its head, if you will. Now, there are not strict guidelines as to how the local church needs to organize itself. The numbers of committees or task forces or boards or the rest. That is contextual in nature. But I would say that it is important for you to understand that there are some outlines in the discipline that you can adapt to what your local church finds necessary. And at the end of this little narrative that I have, we will see a video of the pastors of this church, Dean Francis, who is the senior pastor, and Jane Chima, who is the deacon, and their leadership in trying to figure out, under the rubric of the discipline, how do you organize this church in terms of effectively doing ministry and mission. And you will see that they experimented in their conversation with a variety of structures to be used, and finally came to a particular structure that met their context at that time. I would say to you that since I did that interview with them a couple of years ago, they have taken other steps, which is to consolidate the amount of meeting time to a church council and only basically what is described in the discipline, so that they could have far more opportunity for study and for mission, and to engage people in study and mission. You will see that it is outlined in slide number 2 that there is, therefore, this church council that is described in paragraph 252 and following. And it is critical to note that it first starts out with an understanding of the areas of mission and ministry. Now, I have not done this in the appropriate order in this slide, and I did that intentionally. And the first is that many churches care about management, the money and the people, above all other things. And the program comes after that. The discipline has been quite clear, especially in 2012, that it is the nurture of the church, the worship of the church, the outreach of the church. These are the fundamental things that we need to care about. These are our core values. These are the practices that the church council needs to deal with fundamentally and primarily. Nurture, witness, worship. You may configure them any way you like. The discipline has a great deal of license as to how you do it, but it's the areas that you need to pay attention to in the church council. The way I have it here on slide 2 picks up with an old-fashioned notion that you may encounter in your church. And my advocacy to you is to look to the discipline, and the discipline basically says, and can you imagine this? 1,000 people gathered from all over the world are messing around in what the church conference or church council is supposed to do with its agenda. Why would they do that? Because far too often we deal with issues of management, money, buildings, people. And we never get to the fundamental issues: nurture, worship, outreach. And it talks about the agenda being structured. So what is purposeful, what is important, what is basically what we do and who we are, gets primary attention. In order to resource that, you see, to resource those fundamental thrusts of our ministry and what we value, then we come to the administrative committees. Then they resource, they support, they don't drive what the program is. And what are they? Staff parish, the relationship to the appointed clergy, the lay leadership, the finance committee, and the board of trustees. And another shift has been made. The first place of privilege is not given to the appointed clergy. It is given to the lay leadership of the church. So it is listed, lay leadership and described in the discipline, staff parish relations described in the discipline, the board of trustees briefly described, and then you're referred to the latter, the 2,500 paragraphs of the discipline. We'll go over those after we see the interview with Dean and with Jane, and then the finance committee. Critical. And so let us look into those pieces as we get here into the purpose or into the organization of the church. You read here in paragraph 252 and following basically what it is that the church council is supposed to do. And also, what are the variety, and this is stimulating stuff. I know you're saying, really? Really? But it is. It should open up your capacity to think and to dream. These are not required committees, but ways in which the church might organize itself for what has been important historically over the years and what it is supposed to do in the church. And you will read those coming all the way through paragraph 257. And I will leave those not only to your reading, but please to your imagination. What are the variety of ministries? What do you have in your church now? How might they be flexible? How might they evolve over the years? And have they evolved over the years? So now let us go to the administrative committees as well. And you will find those beginning in paragraph 258. And I outline some of those in slides 3 and 4. But read these, if you will, very carefully, because lay leadership is fundamental to the church. I remember when I first started in ministry, and far too often I hear about this, we talked about filling slots. We needed 9 people on every committee. Every committee at the local church was the same, regardless of how large or small the church was, where it was located, and what it found its fundamental ministry to be. People were put into those slots, and many times they never showed up for a meeting because they didn't know what they were supposed to be doing. This is not about committee work. This is about ministry. This is about finding your calling fulfilled through the life of the church. It requires training. It requires nurture. It requires prayer. It requires study. It requires value. How are you being valued by the church for what you do as a leader with the gifts and graces that you have? And so that's why it has moved from just a place filler to a fundamental place of nurturing persons, not just into leadership, but fundamentally into ministry through the church as a model of the ministry they might have in the world. And so as you read those paragraphs that have to do with lay leadership, I would talk to you very fundamentally about these places as an expression of discipleship, prayer, study, and living out your life in the world. Second, point 2 in paragraph 258 is pastor parish, or often known as staff parish relations. These are professing members of the local church or charge or associate members, and you will read who is there. And it is important to have a functioning staff parish relations committee. Now, the reason for that, obviously, is that in some places this would be known as the personnel committee. But this committee is the committee that works with the district superintendent around the appointment of pastors, elders, deacons, as well as licensed local pastors. They are the ones that speak on behalf of the church council, the charge conference, and the whole church when it comes to setting the profile and interviewing the new pastor when they come. It is important for them to know that process even before a new pastor needs to be appointed to the church, so that they understand that pastoral ministry is about the connection, not simply about a way in which we dispatch a pastor to the local church. This is also a highly sensitive committee because it does deal, and you will read this in these paragraphs, it does deal with sensitive matters of personnel. Not only in the joy of hiring them and discerning the right persons that will be able to resource the ministry and mission as set out by the church council and the charge conference, as well as the budget that establishes who shall be those that will be employed to work with the lay leadership and resource the ministry and mission of the church, but also in terms of evaluation, in terms of discipline, and sometimes in terms of termination. If it is a person who is hired by the local church, there are procedures that are embedded here that will talk about the way in which persons are to be given a fair hearing, that due process needs to be followed. It is also important that the Staff Parish Relations Committee develop and be clear about their job descriptions, their expectations, their benefits, the way in which persons are to be supervised, their capacity for self-evaluation, and access to someone in case there is a complaint or a concern, that they do not necessarily need to go to their direct supervisor, but may come to the Staff Parish or the Pastor Parish Relations Committee. This is also the place, and people need to be trained for this, this is also the place where persons are interviewed about their calling into licensed or ordained ministry. The historic questions of examiners that have been put before all persons who are going into these discrete called ministries of elder and deacon and licensed local pastor. Wesley's questions for examiners have been, for well over 200 years, applied to everyone who has come through this process. It is a critical process of the Staff Parish Relations Committee, and they need to be trained in order to do this and to see this very fundamental and important work. Too often, the local church does simply rubber stamp what someone will do in terms of going through this process because they are a favored son or daughter of the church. This is not right. This is a place of fundamental discernment. This is a place where it's not whether you say, yes, you should go into ordained or licensed ministry, or no, I don't think this is for you. This is a part of the ongoing discernment of how a person should serve Jesus Christ. And sometimes our favored daughters and sons think that they have a call to the ordained ministry. They will go to licensing school or course of study school or off to seminary, invest a great amount of time and energy and money into this endeavor, when all along, many times in the local church, we knew and we should have been honest and directive and loving and embracing and walking with persons as they would move forward in their ministry together. Staff Parish Relations is absolutely important, as is lay leadership. Please, folks on that committee need to be trained as to what the United Methodist Church expects of this connectional relationship and of nurturing pastors. As I said, after the interview with Dean and Jane, we will come back to the Board of Trustees and give you time to search for that at the end of the discipline. But let us also now talk about the Finance Committee. The Finance Committee basically does what it says it does. It is to manage and manage well the resources of the church. They are entrusted to the church, and the Finance Committee are stewards of the church's finance. The Finance Committee needs to be apprised of best practices in accounting and spending the money. It must spend the money in the way in which it was given. If a person designates money to a particular use, it needs to be used for that purpose and that purpose only, not even borrowed to be used for some other purpose with the intention of paying it back. In this way, it's good stewardship. The Finance Committee is to be a resource to the church council. It must be a resource to the lay leadership and to the clergy leadership. It is to have timely reports of the income as well as timely reports of the liabilities that the church has and their timely payments. The Finance Committee needs to understand that over the 52 weeks of any given year, money does not come in at a regular stream, but should be able to develop instruments that will track income over time to see if the income and the outgo match each other given the seasons of the year. They should apprise themselves of the best possible finance practices in the world as well as in the Book of Discipline. They should subject themselves to external audits as provided here from time to time and internal audits as often as possible, not only to be sure that the money is safe and stewarded well, but also to receive an understanding of how to perfect the way in which the money is handled. As you will see described in the discipline, the money that is given to the church must be cared for and counted in a specific way. There are careful ways in which persons who count should not be related to each other, should not count as a single person, but a variety of people should be there and trained to do it. It should be banked in a particular way that safeguards the person who does the banking as well as safeguards it from theft and other corruption. And that the money is spent through the office of the treasurer, who is not the financial secretary, so those who bring the money in are discrete from those who spend the money. There are other pieces in the discipline which are absolutely essential for you as a leader of the church to understand. I must say that far too often, and I was like this myself, I felt that it was the laity who would know how to deal with the money best. And they do, by and large. But pastors need to be apprised, not only of the church's business, its mission, its vision, its narrative, its plan, its practices, and its values, but also the business of the church. Is it balancing its budgets? Is it spending wisely? Is it investing in the future? These are spiritual as well as fiscal matters, and I commend these to you. But remember that the 4 committees, finance, lay leadership, trustees, and staff parish, are resources for the programs of nurture, worship, outreach, as envisioned and planned for by the church council and the charge conference. And they need to be ordered in that way. And now I'll turn to an interview that I did with my colleagues, Dean Francis and Jane Chima, as they, understanding the discipline, wrestled through the context that they confronted here at First United Methodist Church in Evanston, a great church, a church that is well known throughout the connection, but had moved into a time of its life where it needed refreshing, revisioning, and reorganizing. And over the last decade and a half, they have led this church to revitalize, rejuvenate, revision, and they are now again moving into greater and larger ministries and mission. And listen to their story, and I hope that you find it edifying, and I will see you on the other side. Hello, I'm Mark Fowler, the Executive Director of the Institute for Transformative Leaders and Communities. First United Methodist Church in Evanston, Illinois is experiencing a great resurgence in activity, discipleship, and mission. This is an historic church, the church of Francis Willard, the church of J. Fremont Tittle, and the current pastors, Dean Francis and Jane Chima, have been in leadership for 16 years and have overseen this resurgence in worship, in mission, and discipleship. And I sat with them today, and we talked together.
Well, I think when Jane and I have been here, we're in our 16th year, and when we first arrived here, the church really didn't have the resources to do a whole lot. It was basically in a survival mode, and it wasn't surviving particularly well. So we kind of floundered around for several years, really, trying to figure out what we ought to be doing or what our focus ought to be. But I think within the first 5 years or so, we figured out that we had to have an emphasis on Sunday morning, and that we played around with following other churches' models around trying to do things on Wednesday nights or trying to, stack things on weeknights. And it didn't work. It didn't work, I think, initially because we didn't have the size to do it or the resources. It didn't work also because many of the households or families in the congregation have at least one person that's in the loop. They don't get back here until 7:30 at night. They haven't had dinner.
I think we started to figure out, as there started to be a little bit of movement in the congregation, that our population was not just from the neighborhood. And so this draw to centering things around worship on Sunday morning was based on the fact that people were coming from a broader geographic area, so we needed to create a community around the one time we were all together, and that was Sunday morning, even though Wednesday would have been great, but we have to come on Sunday.
So that really was the focus of our beginning. So in many ways we got smaller. We stopped playing around with a lot of weekday activities. I mean, we still had committee life going on in weekdays, and although some of that stuff has been loaded into after church on Sunday or other times as well. And in general, I think that has worked. And for a while, we had a mantra on staff that if it doesn't happen on Sunday, it doesn't happen. We've gotten large enough now that we have been able to expand from that. But it still is a fairly, there has to be a reason or a rationale for it not to be on Sunday. And we have that, but we just are intentionally trying to always push as much program into Sunday as we possibly can, because we know it's the one time we have people captive here.
Right. And I think that one of the first pushes toward becoming really missional was recreating the organizational structure of the church, and we got away from a heavy organizational structure with all kinds of committees and a really heavy meeting life, and we moved to trying to empower people to go out and actually do the ministry that they were interested in, that they were called to, and I really think that led to us focusing in certain ways on mission.
Yeah, I would think that's probably true as well. Now it would be even for the key leaders, the key top leaders of the church, it would be unusual for a leader in the church to be in a committee meeting more than a couple of times a month. And
that would be a lot.
That would be a lot.
Right.
And I would say the norm for most people is no more than once a month. And that's an intentional movement on our part, because we feel that people are better disciples of Jesus by being in study or service than they are in the administrative life of the church. And the place where we continue to get pushback from the congregation around that. We're in the midst of our long-range planning process right now. And where we get pushback are from the people that join the church from United Methodist congregations, and they don't get it at all. They can't understand how we operate without several different committees that everybody's got a voice and presence on, and they're completely puzzled.
They come in kind of, well, this is a big church. All right, let's get involved in going to meetings here.
Yeah.
And there's not much.
So, and as Jane and I and the long range planning people have been talking about it, is that I think the place where we've gotten confused, even the staff has gotten confused, is the difference between governance and communication. Mm-hmm. And we probably have thrown some of the baby out with the bathwater in terms of we need to ramp up our communication so that a wide variety of church members can be involved in that sense, knowing what's going on, understanding what's going on. But we don't need, in my view, a wide variety of members being involved in governance. Again, when we came in 1995, there was virtually no mission work going on here at all. The congregation hadn't been able to consistently pay even its apportionments for, I would say, a couple of decades.
And mission work was really kind of centered still in this, in the UMW, and in the sense of both missional activity and missional giving. And
I would say, I think, maybe 5 years before, around the early 1990s, the church didn't even have a missions committee, mission, any kind of organizational structure, other than the United Methodist Women to do this work. So I have been a part of congregations that have always been missionally oriented, and I just felt strongly that the way we were going to lead out was to be in service to others. And Jane had that same approach and belief as well.
But the connection, I think, comes from a certain decision made here, and I think the connection comes from you decided and led us in having our youth be in worship. Mm-hmm. That prior to your coming here, there was youth Sunday school during worship, and so there was no invitation for our youth to be part of this gathered community, to be gathered at the table, and this was Dean's decision. So we got the youth in worship, and we structured classes at a different time, and I think that created a place of belonging where we have kind of gone from there. And you're exactly right, Mark, when you asked, how has this process been led? It has been youth-led. We took our first youth group on a mission trip with Appalachia Service Project in 1998, and since then it's just kind of snowballed. And we have adults going on mission trips now because they've watched the youth bring so much back to this community from their experiences.
One of the things that drove that decision around the rescheduling on Sunday morning, again, it goes back to Sunday morning to some degree, but one of the things that drove that was just listening to our own members whose kids were now in their late 20s, early to mid 30s, who were no longer in the church, who had grown up in this church, who'd been actively involved in the youth programs of this church, who, by all measures and standards, would be the next disciples of in this or some other congregation, and almost to a person, they were gone. They found no involvement. There's no involvement in the church whatsoever. And there's a lot of pain. There still is a lot of pain in this congregation in regard to that. But it basically revolved around kind of a 1960s model of youth work that said, the way we create a safe environment for youth in the church is to make a separate community for them that is completely distinctively outside of what the church is. And we let the old people do their thing with church, and then we go and do cool stuff that's more relevant and more, all of the. I mean, I've been a part of that. We've all, anybody that's my age or older has certainly been a part of that, and it clearly didn't work. It didn't form disciples. It didn't form community. It didn't form a tradition of youth worshiping. Mm-hmm.
They're not prepared to articulate their faith on their own or to practice their faith on their own, and that's really what has happened in the process here, that we're nurturing young people who have a vocabulary of faith, who are articulate about what they believe, who understand the importance of being part of the gathered community on Sunday morning. This past Sunday we had 2 of our communion servers were high school boys. We had a youth that was part of our making announcements to the worship or the gathered community, but we've really shifted that.
What we have done, especially in the youth or the adult mission work that we've done, is to try to expand the horizons of the membership of those bodies. Mm-hmm. Early on, our missional work would be pretty recognizable to any other United Methodist congregation in that it would have been a group of retired persons mm-hmm. who had the time and the money to do it. They could go to the Midwest Distribution Center downstate. They had enough money to go to Africa and prior to mm-hmm. our being here, they went to Alaska and did some other. Mm-hmm. They went to India. Mm-hmm. And so they did some international travel and work, but it was a very small number of persons that had the resources and had the time. And what we've tried to do is intentionally say, in the selection process for these trips and for these experiences, that we're going to give preference to persons that have never done it before. Mm-hmm. And we do.
And that we'll fund that.
And that we will fund it if necessary. Right. And one of the stories that I've been able to tell over and over again is that my first international mission trip was to Bolivia. It was through a volunteer mission trip a long, long time ago. And I didn't really have an interest in doing it. And a family in my congregation in Kalamazoo said, "We really think you should do this, and we will fund it. We're going to pay your way to go." I was the associate pastor in that congregation at that time, and that's really what got me going. And I've said to the missions folks here, the missions committees here, we need to be investing in our young people in the same way. Mm-hmm. And so this last year, when we went to Ghana, we took 5 college kids, but we didn't say, you got to put down the $3,000 or whatever the dollars were to go there. We said, well, you give us half and we'll give you half. Mm-hmm. And there was a little resistance to that, but not a lot. Yeah. And it's an enormous investment on the church's part to do this.
I think there are more questions being asked. I think we're starting to create a context where people can, through worship and this community, process a little bit more about what they see when they travel. And then the context is that context of being part of a Christian community and coming back to wonder, if I really am living as a disciple of Jesus, what does it mean when I travel to these places, or I live in this way, or I choose to spend my money in this way? What does that mean? And what might it mean to be a mission mm-hmm. in that way? Mm-hmm. I think a context is being created and questions are being raised.
I would guess, and I know that there are some families and households in our congregation that could go to, Africa or a third world country and never encounter the poverty or deprivation in that country. And we haven't spoken to that directly, but I think we speak to it indirectly through the missional work. And actually, and I was thinking about this when my family's decision, my wife and I's decision to go to Scotland, like it's deprived, but to do a house exchange there is a different kind of understanding of how you're in community with that country or the people of that country than it is to go and stay at the Hilton. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that has an impact. I don't know. It wasn't. I would like to say that it was intentionally thought out. It wasn't. It just is kind of who we are. Mm-hmm. And I think both Jane and I have. Jane's got much more extensive international travel than I do, but I think we both have a desire to be with the people of the countries that we mm-hmm. travel.
Well, and that relational piece, though, is I think what gets communicated here when the high school students come back from a summer mission trip to Perry County, Kentucky. They come back and they don't talk about, oh my goodness, it was awful and the poverty was just horrible and I could hardly stand it, they come back and they say, oh, I worked on Bill's house, and Bill's this amazing guy. He only got to college for a year, but he knows so much, and his daughter is beautiful, and she's so smart, and she's going to grow up to be a really neat person. They come back and talk about relationships, and I think that affects then the relationships in this community.
We refer to it, both Jane and I refer to it often in our preaching. It is an example of what we are doing, what we have been doing. I just had a kind of a throwaway example about it last Sunday about this, the Salt Lake in Senegal that I'd been to. So I think that's an important thing that we keep reminding the congregation, we keep reminding ourselves, and we keep highlighting for new people that this is what we do. This is part of who we are. So I think that's an important dynamic. I think we continue to seek to grow in our use of world music and other kinds of music. I mean, when we arrived here, the idea that you could use a drum from a native drums from Senegal in worship, or it just would have never happened. And we've got a ways to go still in that, but we're moving in that direction.
I think there's a growing sense, in our carefully crafted plan here, but I think there's a sense developing of. We talk a lot about what it means to be someone that's claimed and called by God. And when we're called by God to live as a child of God, that really means that we serve. We go out to serve others. And as a deacon, this is part of what I think my role is, to communicate this. So if we worship on Sunday morning, and there are, on any given Sunday, probably 50 individuals who have been returned from a mission trip in the past 6 months worshiping there, that affects us, I think, because you look out and you see them, and all these youth are there, and we're singing together, and we're participating in the liturgy together. We're gathered at table, and so I think this just sense of presence is really important. Mm-hmm. It's not like people go on a big mission trip and it's the one event in their life and then they kind of fall away from the church. It's really a pattern of becoming who we're called to be. Mm-hmm. And so this participation in worship, I think, has developed too from some of our missional work. At least for the high school students it has.
And I think the other thing that we have done quite intentionally is a sense of focus on certain places where we just return over and over and over again. Right. The ASP is certainly that. Mm-hmm. When Katrina happened, and youth groups all over the country flocked there, as well they should, don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. We made a commitment to stay in Appalachia because that need didn't change. Mm-hmm. And we've said we're gonna hunker down in certain areas and do the work there, and that's been true. It took us a little while, but that's now true in Ghana. I mean, we have a solid relationship with the Methodist Church in Ghana, and that's not going away. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that there aren't other places in the world that need our help. There are, but for us to motivate and inspire people to continue to do this work, I think the commitment to a single place makes a great difference. Mm-hmm. And Methodism, for all of its, one of the problems for Methodists, at least for local Methodist churches, is you get the Advanced Special book out, and it's got thousands of places of service, and I think people are just overwhelmed by that. And so if you say to people in a congregation, we're here, here, and here, which is what we do, I think it works. And people then it's a story that people can tell to their neighbors and their friends, and it does become an evangelizing. This church, they went and they built a dormitory in Ghana. This church did a youth conference in Ghana. So that and that's not a huge. I mean, given the overall budget of our congregation, it's not a lot of money, but it's an enormous amount of money to them. Mm-hmm. And so when we spend thousands there rather than 500 on this offering and 500 on that offering, we just have a much bigger impact, and I think we're continuing to encourage people to participate.
So as you can see, in addition to the Book of Discipline, it is absolutely essential that you keep abreast of the latest church leadership understanding of pieces, because they work together. The church has moved in the last 30 years or so from dictating in its discipline the way in which the local church needs to organize down to the numbers of committees and who should be on them, to a much more open and freeing way of organizing, given the context. Areas that we need to pay attention to, and for resourcing committees. But your obligation is to keep abreast of the latest understanding of church leadership, which is a whole other series of courses, which I would be happy to teach you, that we have here at Garrett Evangelical, and there's a plethora of material online and in a variety of libraries. And I pray that you continue to read in that area. So let me turn to the final slide, and that's slide number 6. And I would recommend that you simply jot down the points of that slide as I'm talking for the next few minutes, and then return with your discipline open to paragraph 2525. And you will find that this is not part of the organization and administration of the local church. This is in an area that is discrete, called church property. And the reason that it is discrete is because the Board of Trustees have legal standing in the world as the Board of Trustees of the local church. Now, in many nonprofit organizations, boards of trustees are the governing body and the legal corporation of the church. In the United Methodist Church, the governing body is a connectional body. It is the charge conference. The legal standing of the local church is embodied in the Board of Trustees. Legal standing, meaning that they are the one that executes contracts for the purchase and sale of the real estate of the local church, for borrowing money from a bank on behalf of the local church, and of managing the investments of the endowment of the local church. Those three important pieces. They do so in trust. Not in trust of the local church, but in trust of the annual conference, in whom most local churches are incorporated. Let me go over that again. Most local churches are incorporated in the annual conference, and you will find that described here. Some are incorporated themselves for specific reasons that you will also find here. Very important that you know that. The local board of trustees of a local charge or church is given these responsibilities in trust by the annual conference. And none of them, the reception of endowment funds or their investments, the purchase and sale of real property, or the borrowing of money for the purposes of buying or selling property or sustaining a new ministry or mission of the church, can be done without the approval of the connectional officer, meaning the district superintendent, and the pastor as both pastor of the local church and connectional officer. So all that the local board of trustees does is done as a trust from the connectional office in the district superintendent as an officer of the annual conference. In some cases, even the bishop and the superintendent or the secretary of conference must sign on what is done by the Board of Trustees. So it's essential for us to understand that the Board of Trustees of a local church does what it does in trust of the annual conference. I know I've said that a million times, but it must be an important piece you teach a local Board of Trustees, and that way is not the same as all of the other committees and commissions of the church. It is also the reason that the pastor is not an ex officio member of that board like the pastor would be on all other boards. They are not. They can go, they can sit, they can counsel, they cannot vote. The pastor is not ex officio. The pastor's role is to convene the Board of Trustees as soon as they are elected at a charge conference, to elect their own officers internally. This again is very, very important. They cannot be elected by the charge conference because that would determine a legal entity being determined by somebody else. So their officers must be elected internally. That's the pastor's role, is to conduct that election. And so those are very, very important pieces for you to keep in mind. These are trustees, and the trustees hold in trust for the annual conference. It is connectional what they do in trust. You will see that all approvals are cooperative. And it is important for you to note along three different areas that local church buildings must basically meet the requirements that are here in the discipline. Parsonages that are owned to the church, and these are fairly new in the discipline to describe the minimum requirements of a parsonage, and it deals with accessibility in a new way. I was there. I never thought that I would see a discipline that basically would describe how many bathrooms there were in a home and where they needed to be, but this is about the connectional ministry together. So it's a very, very important piece for you to know about this. It's also a couple of things that I'd like to caution us about. Number one, it became a practice that was not acceptable to the discipline, but was allowed to happen for unknown reasons, for churches to borrow money to run their regular program from the trustees' funds. They can't do that. It is against the discipline, and in this case, it is not only bad practice, but it could be argued that it's illegal. That if money is borrowed, it is to be borrowed against the building or other buildings. That building money is building money. It is not program money. Now, endowed funds can either be for the building or they can be for ministries. They must be invested, and many annual conference have a foundation with whom you can invest them along particular guidelines with the fiduciary responsibility that a decent rate of return is given and that there is guidance as how you take that rate of return and invest it in the program or the buildings that is there to endow. And those are very, very important pieces. The other aspect of this is that one cannot sell real estate in order to raise an endowment that is basically going to underscore the program of the church. These are discrete matters. They can be infuriating sometimes in terms of our mission, but they are absolutely essential. Far too often, churches, for very good missional reasons, dedicated to their outreach and their care of others, have borrowed against their buildings and have been unable to pay back what they borrowed for themselves with good intention. What they have done, in the end, is that they have saddled the next generation for paying back that money or caring for their building, and therefore compromising the very mission that the original borrowers were so intent on preserving. at a level that is astronomical, that basically has led to the demise of many local churches because they could not afford their buildings. They were too big, they were out of repair. And when they turned to find the endowment that had been set aside for the care of those buildings, it was gone. And so I would commend to you the trustees section of the discipline to read its codicils, to abide by them, because you are held in trust by the annual conference. And we'll see you next week and talk about some of these very matters.